endurance was really, I think, the showstopper at ASCO. It was a plenary session, beautifully presented by my colleague, Dr. Shaji Kumar. This compared RVD to KrD in over 1,000 patients. And I think many of us, myself included actually, assumed that KrD would show an advantage over RVD in terms of response and progression-free survival. My own personal concern was that there would be tolerability differences that would be very relevant. My only thinking around that would be that, perhaps then we would see some groups of patients benefiting from KrD and others benefiting clearly from RVD. What was very surprising was that the progression-free survival was identical for both groups at 34 months. And the responses overall weren't radically different. What was different was the quality of responses in favor of KrD. And then I think the biggest news from the endurance trial was the tolerability profiles, where in fact, the rates of serious cardiopulmonary, renal, and vascular toxicities associated with KrD were 16%, whereas they were less than 5% for RVD. So whilst neuropathy was more of a challenge with RVD, clearly the cardiovascular, pulmonary, renal signal from KrD was a concern. So the conclusions of the study were that RVD remains the standard of care in the upfront induction remission setting for newly diagnosed myeloma. But the important caveat is that for high-risk patients, KrD may be an ideal choice as long as there isn't risk from the vascular toxicity, because that particular subgroup were not formally addressed in the endurance trial. There were high-risk patients in the endurance trial characterized by ISS3 disease and also by translocation 414. And interestingly, if you looked at that subgroup, there was a trend in favor of the KrD. So I think very, very important information for the field. And Dr. Kumar also concluded that in terms of a platform for add-ons, in other words, if you're going to be adding an antibody and so forth, RVD, we're doing that with the addition of daratumumab and other antibodies, KrD too, but obviously RVD is the established platform given this highest level phase 3 information, is the sort of recommended platform for new drug development in the upfront setting. But I do want to stress, I think Carfilzomib clearly has a role. There's no question about it in the upfront setting, in my view. But I think also strategically, if you're using Bortezomib in your front line, Carfilzomib becomes an outstanding partner of choice and proteasome inhibitor of choice in second line for patients in whom any of the potential vascular risks may not be predominant. I have to say that I think a number of us had always been very much aware of the endothelial toxicity that we see with Carfilzomib, but it's the most potent proteasome inhibitor we have, and without a doubt, you've got results from head-to-head trials demonstrated clearly in the relapse setting that it behaves, the obvious one being Endeavor, where it is essentially show clearly that after Bortezomib versus Carfilzomib as a doublet. In both cases, clearly Carfilzomib performed better. But in a way, I see this as a win-win because it helps us strategize. You'll use RVD first, you'll then have a Carfilzomib-based platform second. And, treating myeloma, Charlie, is a marathon. It's not a sprint, and we have to be able to think strategically. And I think particularly in the era of COVID-19, there are a number of takeaways from this. One, we have to worry, obviously, about the vascular issues because COVID-19 is such a dangerous virus when it comes to the vasculature. So that's not trivial for our patients. That's an important consideration. And the second thing, which is somewhat more complicated, obviously, is cost. Because as Dr. Vincent Rajkumar pointed out in the series of the conversations that followed the presentation, the additional cost of Carfilzomib to each cycle in the United States by wholesale acquisition is $10,000 more than RVD. And in the new world that we're living now, facing the challenges that are being imposed by the pandemic, the economics of treatment really matter.